As Sri Lankan President Ranilwickremesinghe announces an all-clear for the IMF loan package, is the island now out of the deep on its debts crisis? And has India's support tilted the balance away from China?
India had really come to our rescue. India had provided us a lifeline which allowed us to stay afloat during a very difficult time.
We will also be joined by the Hindu's Meera Srinivasan shortly on the show. Hello and welcome to Worldview at the Hindu with me, Suhasini Haidar. This is episode 99, yes, just a week away from number 100. Now, after a month of bad news, Sri Lankan President Ranil Wickremesinghe announced in Parliament this week that Sri Lanka has cleared the last of its hurdles to being approved for a $2.9 billion bailout from the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. While a final decision is expected to be announced during the IMF spring session and a first tranche, in fact, is expected within the next month, the news is expected to boost creditor confidence in the country that has been reeling from the COVID crisis, economic mismanagement by previous regimes of the Rajapaksas and before that the Sirisena regime, and mounting debts. And we're going to take a closer look at all of those. But just take a look at the situation Sri Lanka has come through over the past few years. One, the political turmoil that we saw with the quick, rapid exits of Prime Minister Mahinda and then President Gotabaya's sudden exit. In fact, he left the country for a brief point. There was a tense standoff there with the military and police and protesters as soaring inflation hit the common man. Nearly 80% inflation, consumer price inflation, really in September last year. GDP exports collapsed and they went down to nearly negative 12% in the third quarter of 2022. So the GDP slump, remittances went down, exports and manufacturing, everything else. A currency collapse. The rupee of Sri Lanka really went down, plummeting over a period of a few months. It went from about 220 to 365 rupees per dollar. That has stabilized a little bit, total debt by April 2020. And this was the biggest thing. The total debt of Sri Lanka that we saw was $35 billion. This included, and you can see on that pie chart there, multilateral borrowings, bilateral borrowings, the big one, China, about $5 billion there, as well as open market borrowings as well. And then we saw the impact of the India-China rivalry, including, of course, last year with that Hambantota ship incident where India came out publicly and said it did not want that ship to dock in Sri Lanka. Eventually, the ship docked, but India and Sri Lanka have gone a long way since then on their ties. India's support at this time actually is a combined $4 billion, but it came over different areas. One was the shipment of grain, of fuel, of essentials like milk powder, of medicines. India also gave Sri Lanka credit lines and currency swaps, a debt repayment relief through the Asian Clearing Union, support at the IMF. This was important to work on that bailout package. And in contrast to China, India's support came unconditionally, more promptly, in fact, just when it was asked for. While India provided written assurances as required by the IMF more than a month ago, China's assurances had actually held up the process. They finally came through this week. And finally, India has been giving Sri Lanka multilateral support at the G20, as well as the BIMSTEC and other regional organizations, with the idea of bringing Sri Lanka's indebtedness as a real chronic problem in the developing world and how to deal with it. So earlier, I sat down with Sri Lankan Foreign Minister MUM Ali Sabri. He was earlier the finance minister, in fact. He was visiting Delhi, and I spoke to him for an interview and began by asking him just how tough this year has been and what India's support meant. Listen in.
Now, India, we have had very good discussions during the last 2 years or so. Of course, we have been traditionally very good friends. But during the last year or so, India had really come to our rescue. India had provided us a lifeline which allowed us to stay afloat during a very difficult time. Results could be slowly seen now. Inflation is down. Rupee has stabilized. More tourists are coming back, and more remittances are coming on the group. So we are not out of the wood, but stabilized it. Right now, what we are looking at, the recovery and the growth. For that, we need investment. So right now, what we are interested with India is to how to collaborate and how to integrate with the Indian economy, particularly in the south and all those things in terms of investment, people-to-people connection, more tourists to coming in. So that's the kind of thing is a win-win situation for all.
I also asked him what the IMF bailout that seems to be clear now would actually mean for Sri Lanka.
What we want in IMF is, with the moment IMF comes in, it brings a lot of creditworthiness to the entire system and confidence. It's not the IMF 2.9 billion per se given out in 2 to 3 years time make a huge difference, but the fact that IMF is engaged, IMF is, we are under the counseling of IMF means there is a lot of sense of confidence comes back to the situation. So there is a lot of other agencies like World Bank, AIIB, ADB have lined up a lot of funds to come in, and institutes like the JICA, Japanese agency is there. So IMF is very, very central for us to get the confidence back on track. And then probably if we have thereafter, if we have a good, understandable debt restructure in session, then our debt becomes more sustainable. And with that, we will probably have access to the capital market once again. That's the plan. So that will, now we are stabilizing the economy. We have prevented a catastrophical drive which some other countries have seen. We have managed, I think, inflation pretty well, 95% to the 50%. So that's a good achievement comparatively what we were in last year. But the growth to take place and recovery to take place, confidence need to build. And for that, IMF bailout is very, very central for us.
So while the IMF bailout may not seem like a lot, given its $35 billion indebtedness, for Sri Lanka, the creditor confidence, the coming back of creditors, as well as the access to capital markets, is really key. Now, let's also get a perspective from the ground with the Hindus correspondent, Meera Srinivasan in Colombo. She'd really covered the protests, you'd watched her on Worldview, and all that has happened since then. Speaking to Meera, I actually asked her earlier, 1 year since the protests, political turmoil, deep despair over Sri Lanka. Just how much has now changed a year later for ordinary Sri Lankans who were out there on the streets?
Indeed, Suhasini, I'm outside the presidential secretariat where we witnessed dramatic scenes in July last year, and it's been a year since pocket protests started in Sri Lanka, but at this point the government believes things are looking up with the IMF's promised $2.9 billion package coming within touching distance after China recently gave financing assurances. All the same, we're seeing a new wave of protests by unions and students who say that the cost of living is still very high and economic distress prevails. And we've seen that taxes have increased and utility bills have been increased threefold, and people are saying it's very hard to make ends meet. And there is also some concern about repression and the right to protest as things get very hard for the ordinary Sri Lankan.
Now, in a speech on Women's Day, President Wickremesinghe actually thanked 3 women in particular: Nirmala Sitharaman, the Finance Minister of India, Janet Yellen in the US, and Kristalina Georgieva from the IMF for helping Sri Lanka out. There was a notable absence of China, it seemed. Is there some unhappiness with the time that China has taken to help Sri Lanka to give those guarantees?
Yes, the president made that speech on Women's Day, and interestingly, Sri Lankan cartoonists have highlighted the absence of Sri Lankan women on that list because they point to women who are central to Sri Lanka's foreign exchange earnings, be it those employed in the tea estate sector or the garment factories, or those employed as domestic laborers abroad and sending in remittances. So that was some interesting commentary coming in after the president's speech. On the question of China, I think earlier there was a little bit of concern that it was taking longer than Sri Lanka would have liked to obtain China's financing assurances, especially since India and Japan, as part of the Paris Club, wrote to the IMF earlier this year. But once that came through recently, all leaders in Sri Lanka, including those in opposition, have been quick to thank China, and they have said that they look forward to having talks with all 3 major bilateral creditors, China, Japan and India, to restructure the debt.
And Meera, in his interview to The Hindu, Minister Sabri actually said that India rescued Sri Lanka and is looking now for more investments from India. Which are the areas that you really expect to see this kind of investment coming in?
In the many ongoing conversations about Sri Lanka's economic recovery after last year's financial crash, we see a lot of emphasis on foreign direct investments. The government seems to believe that it's going to be crucial for Sri Lanka's economic recovery. As far as India is concerned, whether it's in bilateral government-to-government talks or in discussions with the private sector, IT, pharmaceutical, energy sector and education have been identified as some possible areas for Indian investment, and Sri Lanka says they are looking forward to welcoming such investment from India.
So the identified areas are IT, pharmaceuticals, energy, education. That's Meera Srinivasan there from The Hindu in Colombo. Now, another issue between the two countries, a possible problem that emerged this year, has been the controversy over Adani projects in Sri Lanka. Two big ones were awarded to the port to airports infrastructure company over the past few years. One was the wind energy project, a $442 million project for two wind power plants in Mannar and Punarin. These are areas of northern Sri Lanka. They're expected to generate eventually about 350 megawatts of power if it all works out. The other is a $700 million contract to build the West Container Terminal at Colombo Port. This will have an eventual capacity of 3.5 million units, what are called TEUs, a capacity terminal. Now, while the opposition actually both in India and in Sri Lanka has raised issues of the manner in which the company was chosen, which some officials had actually said was due to direct intervention from the Prime Minister's office in Delhi, another issue then became the dramatic drop in share value after the Hindenburg report came out in January. So here's what Sri Lankan Foreign Minister Sabri said about the perception that the Adani Group was picked due to New Delhi's pressure. Listen in.
We were keen on an Indian investor to come in. So who is the Indian investor for the Indian government and the authorities to decide and choose and send it to us. And then we will have our own feasibility and fact finding, and if we are happy, we will take it. So that's how all over the world it's happening. So we are happy and we have no complaint so far because they have investing, they are going on with the project and they have been successful both in India and in the region. So why not? A big name like that comes in. And there are a lot of other countries and other companies could be envious of them and we really don't know. But for us, there is absolutely nothing to worry because it's a transparent process and a government-to-government kind of a project.
Those are significant words. The MEA, remember, Ministry of External Affairs, has so far only said it was a private deal between the two and not a government-to-government project. So some play between the joints over there, some differences between the two. Finally, here is Minister Sabri's answer to the question on how Sri Lanka can now balance its ties with China to India's satisfaction.
Yeah, I think it's a complex relationship because naturally Sri Lanka also been a very close friend of India, doesn't want to do anything which hurts the Indian legitimate sentiments of security concerns. But in the meantime, we also need to understand that we need to work with everybody. But your biggest partner is also, despite all your problems, is China. So you still work with them, the Indian. So similarly, we also want to work with Indians and the Chinese and the West and everybody. But in the meantime, any legitimate security concerns of Indians, we will find a way to discuss with them, collaborate with them, and identify them. And not to repeat any concerns which we could be. But in the meantime, we also want to ensure the freedom of movement in the Indian Ocean for everybody's betterment.
Clearly much warmth for India there now. Sri Lanka's reversal of some of the dire trends of last year is certainly positive for the country. It's also a good example for the entire region and for India that has kept its promise as a good neighbor by delivering help when it was needed in a timely and generous manner without really standing on ceremony. Eventually, it isn't about outspending the rivals in India's neighborhood, including China, but being more sensitive to a neighbor's needs. Let's get you some reading recommendations here on Worldview for you. First, a few books on Sri Lanka, and of course, I've given you some in the past, so I'm just going to add to those. One is The Conundrum of an Island, Sri Lanka's Geopolitical Challenges. This is a recent book by Asanga Abaya Gunasekara. There's also China in Sri Lanka 2013. Now, this is a 2013 book by Atanaya K. Chulani, and this is an author who has written quite a lot of papers on the subject as well. In fact, one of her papers comes in this book, Navigating India-China Rivalry, Perspectives from South Asia. It's edited by C. Rajamohan and Chanjia Hao. And in fact, it has an essay by me on the Bhutan question, but many important essays on Sri Lanka, on China's inroads in the region. Then there is the China Factor, Beijing's Exploring Engagement in Sri Lanka, Maldives, Bangladesh, and Myanmar by Shantanu Roy Chaudhary. There are a few books on economic crises around the world as well, particularly the role of the IMF and what are called the Bretton Woods institutions. One called 3 Days at Camp David by Jeffrey E. Garten. Now, this is really a classic. It's come out more recently, but it tells you all you need to know about how these Bretton Woods institutions really came about and how America changed the course, really, of international public finance in that one meeting with President Nixon. Another book you might find interesting called Boom and Bust, A Global History of Financial Bubbles by William Quinn and John Turner. This is pure history, financial history about some of those big bubbles. It does not include Sri Lanka. Another book which you may have heard of called Why Nations Fail, The Origins of Power, Prosperity and Poverty by Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson. This is supposed to be a classic. And finally, there's a book called Fixing Failed States, a framework for rebuilding a fractured world. Now, this is a book not so heard of because its author went into a little bit of disrepute after what happened in Afghanistan. This is former President Ashraf Ghani, but he wrote this in a previous role in Washington, along with Claire Lockhart. And it is actually fairly easy to read. It gives you a primer, really, on how smaller countries, particularly that are in crises, can be brought around. We hope you enjoy these, and we hope you do join us next week for our 100th episode of Worldview. From the team, thanks for watching.